So it is my pleasure to be the chair moderator for the second panel of our conference. The panel is called Victims, Perpetrators, and Alleged Neutrals, Multidisciplinary Approach to the Holocaust. And it's particularly, of course, a pleasure for me to introduce these three presenters. The papers that they wrote were papers that they wrote for Holocaust and Modern Genocides class from fall 2021. These were three. There were a lot of really excellent papers in the class, and I'm excited that we got this group of three presenters because they truly showcase the diversity of research on the Holocaust and the interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach, right? We have medicine, we have psychology, we have law, we have the arts, so many really, really interesting ways to try to understand this very important formative event of the 20th century. So we're going to start with Madison Phillips. Madison is a history major and a secondary education major and a theater major, and her paper is is the utilization of art, music, poetry, and theater in the Terezin Ghetto as means of survival and resistance.
In the 1940s, the Nazi regime concocted a horrific plan to murder all the Jewish people living in Europe, as well as destroy any remaining traces of their life and culture, to which they named this the final solution. Ghettos were established as holding and working sites for Jewish and minority groups of people before their deportation to extermination camps. Jews were rounded up and forced to live in these ghettos before they were eventually sent by train to a death camp. Many of these camps are significant for individual reasons, but one that stands out from the others is the Terezin Ghetto, also known as the Theresienstadt Ghetto. What made the Terezin Ghetto so different from the others is that the majority of the Jews sent to the ghetto were performers and artists. This was an intentional move by the Nazi regime, as they had deemed the Terezin Ghetto as an example to the world about the proper treatment Jewish people were receiving from the Nazis. The Terezin Ghetto became a breeding grounds for many different artistic expressions, some mandated, others done as a means of protest. Several mandated performances were either done as pure entertainment for Nazi officers or were to be recorded as evidence for the humane treatment of those living in the ghetto. The artistic expressions not mandated by the Nazi regime became a means of escape and even resistance. They could not outwardly protest for fear of their lives, but they could still do so in the art that they were allowed to pursue. In spite of the life that these Jewish artists were forced to lead, as well as their looming fear of death, culture and art flourished within the Terezin Ghetto. The sheer amount of art produced in the face of death was and is quite astonishing, yet it was one of their only coping mechanisms. The first of these creative outlets was traditional art. The Nazis made traditional artists work in drafting workshops, where they were forced to create propaganda artwork for the regime. From there, as well as from the record-keeping facility in the ghetto, these artists would acquire paper, pencils, and ink. With the access to these simple artistic tools, Terezin artists spent their free time drawing the daily life within the ghetto, the landscape, and even the people they encountered. However, these works of art are not as happy as they sound. The majority of the traditional art created was quite dark, looming, and even depressing, which directly reflected the atrocities committed within the ghetto. One famous artist, as well as physician, who often depicted the harsh realities of ghetto life at Terezin was Dr. Karel Fleischmann. It is said that Fleischmann created hundreds of drawings before he was murdered at Auschwitz. Most often, his drawings took a medical perspective, as he was a renowned physician before the war, and he led medicine in the Terezin Ghetto. Fleischmann and the other traditional artists living within Terezin risked their everything to ensure that their lives and Jewish suffering would be remembered. Without the survival of artwork from artists like Fleischmann, historians would not be as informed on how Terezin looked during its inhabitance by thousands of Jews, nor would they be as informed on the prevalence of school and traditional medicine in a place where happiness and health seemed unattainable. Much like traditional artwork, poetry in the Terezin Ghetto was another popular creative outlet. Many of these poems were composed into music to be utilized for concerts or cabarets. One notable poem, titled The Death of Orpheus, written by George Kafka, dealt with the theme of death, a theme not uncommon for poets in the Terezin ghetto. More so than traditional art, poetry was a tool of recognition and self-reflection on life in the ghetto during World War II. Its intention was to invoke existential thought into the hearts of the audience. While the Nazi officers may not have always been able to decipher the meaning behind these poems, the Jewish citizens living in Terezin fully understood, as they had experienced pain like no other. Whereas traditional art was more of a tool to inspire survival, poetry was a tool for lamenting and for acknowledging Jewish suffering. The most prevalent art form in the Terezin ghetto was theater and theatrical performance. Theater was also the least censored of the art forms. After given permission to practice this art form in the ghetto, Jewish theater artists began holding events of their own, not just events that were mandated by the Nazis. Lisa Peschel argued the prevalence of these theatrical artworks was not for the fact that ghetto life was easy. It was because these theatrical artists felt the need to resist against the Nazi regime and resist against their powerlessness. The prisoners felt that in the theater they could finally control an aspect of their life, even if it was just a simple performance. Furthermore, they did not just create lamenting pieces of tragedy for performance. They actively created pieces from all kinds of genres, including comedy. Terezin comedy dealt with serious issues such as trauma, health, food, homes, and the relationship between expectation and reality, but it did so in a satirical manner. In fact, the Terezin ghetto had an extremely low rate of suicide, in part due to the abundance of cultural and theatrical life. Music is the fourth of these creative coping mechanisms, and it is the most confrontational of these art forms created in Terezin. One song written to be part of the Hans Hofer cabarets, entitled The Cow, begins with the lines, "The portions we get are so modestly sized that it's easier here to expire than thrive." And it concludes with the lines, "And what's left of the cow, it's beyond belief. 1 60-gram portion of tender ground beef." These theatrical artists combined their works and their love of theater, poetry, and music into one with the cabarets that they performed. Cabarets are simply theatrical entertainments which include song, dance, and or drama in one big production. The Terezin ghetto hosted several cabarets, including the Czech cabarets, the Strauss cabarets, and the Hofer cabarets. There were a few cabarets that were mandated by the Nazi regime for their entertainment, but those cabarets created by those in the ghetto for those in the ghetto typically had two goals: to incite laughter and to look to the past for inspiration in the future. The second of the Czech cabarets, entitled Laugh With Us, was intended to invoke laughter and was an admiration of the liberated theater that existed in Terezin. Although this cabaret did jump back and forth between comedy and disparity, the Strauss cabaret was intended to distract audiences from the terrible conditions in which they were forced to live, in order to bring a moment of calm in a torrential world. The Hofer cabarets were exaggerated to the point of irony, yet they also created a somewhat accurate portrayal of how the Terezin ghetto functioned. Its comedic style was intended to provide escape, much like the others, through utilization of nostalgia of pre-war life. Unfortunately, much of the art, scripts, music, and poetry created in the Terezin ghetto was liquidated and destroyed by the Nazi regime in their attempts to rid of any evidence of Jewish maltreatment. Despite their suffering, the people of Terezin were strong-willed and tenacious. It was their urge to continue pushing forward in preserving and celebrating their culture that ultimately saved many of them, metaphorically and physically. From the very beginning, traditional art, music, poetry, and especially theater were a means of escapism and resistance to powerlessness, something that could never be taken away from the prisoners in the Terezin ghetto. Thank you.
We are going to switch gears just a little bit from the arts to medicine. And our next presenter is Garrett Weybright. He's a double major in history and psychology, and his paper is called The Juxtaposition of the Human Medical Experiments. Terry. And Terry is going to make his PowerPoint go live.
Okay, thanks for coming out, everybody. The human medical experiments are a notorious aspect of the Holocaust. Many people like to place them at the pinnacle of radical behavior, but in reality, the experiments are no more than a product of a simple interaction. Opportunity meets ideology. You see, in the previous half-century, science had taken on a limitless and boundless form. Suddenly, anything and everything could be attributed to science and fixed with science. Words and ideas such as racial science, racial hygiene, eugenics, and social Darwinism were beginning to infiltrate governmental organizations and were then used or considered to be used as a means to create a healthier or more fit nation. This movement of biological science applied socially was not only a major factor in Hitler's propaganda and personal ideology, but it bared the child that was soon due with the name of human experiments. It is a weird name for a kid, I understand. Initially, human experimentation was undertaken with the objective that conclusions drawn from such would, in one way or another, benefit Germany's military endeavors. This is supported by the fact that in 1942 we see a significant increase in the number of experiments conducted, which coincides with the timeline in which Germany had been experiencing increased military tribulations at either or both of the fronts. They had the Soviets to the east and the remaining Allied powers to the west. But human experiments grew up to be a teenager quickly and soon gained a mind of its own. You hate it when that happens, right? Under the rational decision-making of approximately 265 Nazi doctors, the experiments soon began to deviate from their original pragmatic intentions to now operate under motivations such as careerism, opportunism to satiate intellectual curiosity, and sadism. These motivations typically are found intertwined, operating together synchronously. An experiment where these various motivations can be seen is in the sulfonamide experiments. I will say that word repeatedly and I will continue to butcher it as I just did. The sulfonamide experiments were conducted at the Ravensbrück concentration camp under the direction of Dr. Karl Gebhardt. The objective was to test the effectiveness of sulfonamide as a treatment for gas gangrene, a common injury sustained in combat zones. Sulfonamide is a sulfur compound that has antibacterial properties and have been used effectively for other minor injuries during the war. Gas gangrene is a bacterial infection that takes root in wounds with little to no blood flow, commonly experienced in high-energy battlefield wounds. These will look as one might imagine a severe battlefield wound would look like, and when gas gangrene sets in, the once ugly soon turns grotesque, and if treatment is not imminent, the life of the patient is soon at risk. The German military was searching for methods in order to better treat soldiers who acquired this infection, preferably non-surgical solution, which were what was popular and used, and dare I say it, the most effective. In an ideal world, this would allow soldiers to recover quicker and without the lasting effects surgical treatments would have. You can think of amputation, for example. Dr. Karl Gebhardt was an outspoken proponent for his surgical operations being the best and most effective method in treating this infection. Still, he opted to head the experiments as a way to disprove the effectiveness of sulfonamide and therefore promote his own treatment recommendation. His subjects were primarily female Polish prisoners who soon gained the nickname of rabbits. The nickname came honestly due because of the operation. After the operation, their ability to walk was severely limited, and they had the hop as their primary means of locomotion, or hobble. Regardless of Dr. Gebhardt understanding that their experiments were redundant, he did proceed with them under professional and proper methods, as many of the experimenters in the other experiments often do. When results were inconclusive with the initial tibial grafts, the experimenters caused larger wounds and tied the arteries above and below such to hinder blood from entering the area. That's why you see these severe deformities and missing parts of the leg. In attempts to better represent a battlefield wound, debris that included shards of glass, wood, mud, and dirt were shoved into the wound to manifest an infection. Sulfonamide is too weak of a remedy to stop an active cluster of gas gangrene, and as a result, many subjects died. Their experiments were ultimately a deadly "I told you so" on the part of Gebhardt. His previous conclusions that surgical operations were the best option to treating the infection were now supported even more, giving him credit amongst his peers in the Nazi scientific community. As stated prior, these experiments were redundant. The results were already known, as confessed in a retrospective testimony after the war by Gebhardt himself. They were merely undertaken because, one, it was possible to do so, and two, Gebhardt wanted to displace any doubts about his previous conclusions and understandings. Throughout this experiment, we see numerous motivations occurring. Sadism is evident in Gebhardt's professional tendencies, including his persistence to continue the isolation of variables until a proper and definitive conclusion could be made. He understood that the treatment was ineffective, yet he continued to increase the severity of wounds and therefore suffering. It was also careerism and opportunism that allowed for the redundant inquiry to be entertained in the first place. Only so, in the end, Gebhardt could further support and propagate his previous work and understanding. There were shoe testing experiments conducted at the Sachsenhausen camp that exhibited this dynamic as well. The experiment was initiated with the hopes of finding the most effective/ideal shoe for infantry troops, and this is interesting because it contains common Nazi ideological undertones. Creating the perfect race, idealizing the perfect German man, the perfect German woman, child, etc. The Nazi ideology liked to idealize and strive for perfection, but in reality, as we all know, perfection is arguably unattainable. Nevertheless, they tried. And also, nevertheless, a shoe is not a one-size-fits-all. There are different variables that go into what a shoe fits you best: how tall you are, how big you are, how long your foot is. The regime, however, with these experiments continued to bang their head against the wall for 4 years as they attempted to research and create the perfect universal shoe. Sadism is evident during this. It became common practice for guards to evoke personal desires into the actions of the subjects, desires that assuredly caused unnecessary and cruel suffering for the subject. Subjects were forced to ruck around a track all day, as you see here. That's the actual track, along with a great many other things, only for their feet to be examined at the end of it and no care to be provided after the fact. They would do this in too small shoes, too large of shoes, or no shoes at all. They would do this with 100 pounds on their back or in the complete nude. They would do this in any weather the proctor deemed fit enough for potential scientific analysis, and as you may have guessed, this often included extreme versions of hot and cold. Findings and conclusions were non-existent. There were simply too many variables to administer and to account for, and as I've said, a shoe is not a one-size-fits-all. Opportunity met ideology, so why not create the perfect shoe? There were many other experiments that occurred during this time that reflected similar situations. The seawater, freezing, and high-altitude experiments all were undertaken with pragmatic intentions, all potentially trying to find the extremes that a human can endure, whether that being how long they can survive by drinking only salt water, as the man on the left is currently doing, or how long they can survive in the freezing cold water, or what the effects of sudden and significant pressure changes would have on a human, as the man on the right is currently experiencing. Potential findings and conclusions theoretically could find a use in the military, but the use of such would be limited to esoteric groups of soldiers who would find themselves in situations where their fate would almost already certainly be sealed. Results which ultimately are redundant. Yet you see experimenters devising and conducting experiments consistently under the guise what they are doing is for the benefit of Germany. But consistently you find that the experiments stray from pragmaticism and more towards selfish motivations. They are puppets to their own intellectual curiosity, the ideology that prevailed above them, and the opportunity that was present. You can't blame them for this. What I concluded in my research and explained in my paper was that the researchers themselves were acting under rational mindsets. It is rational to want to further your career, and the ways in which one does so is reflective of the type of the career they are in. In this instance, it would have been incredibly beneficial for German scientists in both clout and material attainment to produce work with the resources available that would aid in the good Nazi cause. Edward Pernkopf, for example, was able to benefit from the deep prison pools for cadaver supply for his anatomical atlas that is still used today, although sparingly, and it's sold for very high prices. Through joining, conducting research, and doing experiments under the Nazi regime, he eventually made rector at the University of Vienna in Austria. His career had previously stagnated, but through his affiliation with the Nazi Party and his work underneath such, his career was able to kick off to one of the highest positions available in academia. There were many others who benefited from the exodus of Jewish workers in the many different fields. The sciences were only one sector of the economy to see a significant increase in Nazi fervor mixed in with the work and the results thereof. I would like to conclude by reiterating that it was rational for experimenters to fulfill their intellectual curiosity due to the limitless opportunities available. While most of the experiments conducted during this time concluded with redundant, inconclusive, or superfluous results, it does not mean they were meaningless to the experimenters or the regime. They were operating under the Nazi ideology, where perfection was the goal. This meant that even the small advances in science and the understanding within were still worthwhile to them. This is especially true when you can understand that the cost of attaining such small and redundant findings wasn't a consideration. In fact, it was an inherent benefit when fatalities would occur, as this would only further be of aid in the elimination of the disease that continued to plague the perfect Aryan race. Thank you.
Okay. Last but certainly not least is Brody Taylor. Brody is a double major in history and secondary education, and his paper is The Lie of Swiss Neutrality During the 20th Century.
Switzerland has long been praised for its international humanitarianism and its neutrality. The truth is that these terms are complex. It can be easy to sell the idea that Switzerland is and always has been a strictly neutral nation. The fact is, however, that Switzerland broke its neutrality during much of the 20th century. After the conclusion of the Second World War, Switzerland was confronted with criticism when Jews began to look for assets which their parents or grandparents had left for them in Swiss banks before it had started. The tragic reality is many of these original asset holders perished as victims in the Holocaust. The discovery of the role that Switzerland played in the war devastated its reputation on a global platform. Switzerland was extremely successful in aiding the Nazi war machine as well as laundering Nazi gold across Europe. The Geneva Convention in 1864 established the International Red Cross and established the foundations of international humanitarian law. Attendees of this convention defined neutrality as not aiding belligerents on both sides of any conflict. While the idea of being truly neutral in all aspects and only aiding in humanitarian efforts is a great idea, when examining history and how it's played out, it's probable to argue that true neutrality is not obtainable. There are many reasons why neutrality is hard to practice and has failed prior. Attempting to be neutral as determined in the Geneva Convention has unintentional impacts on the situation. During conflicts in which the International Red Cross became involved, they unintentionally gave belligerents more power and credibility because those governments used the Red Cross as a token to show that they were humanitarian enough to let them take care of civilians within their borders. While unintentional, it still helped the country, and that is not neutral. Historians today find themselves asking, is neutral humanitarianism dead? And it's probable to argue that, yes, it is. And it's never been possible to truly remain neutral as defined in the Geneva Convention. This meant that before the war started, despite Switzerland declaring itself a neutral nation, they were doomed to fail. By the 1930s, the Swiss had a reputation for having large and secure international banks. As it would turn out, however, they too participated in anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi practices. Here is just one example. Joseph Sapir was a businessman in Warsaw, Poland. His daughter was Estelle. In fear of the Nazi takeover and deportation of Jews, he left a ledger book for his daughter Estelle, who lived in southern France. After living in ghettos in Poland, Joseph died in a concentration camp in 1943. After the war, Estelle knew from the ledger book that her father had left money for her in a British bank and in a Swiss bank. She was able to withdraw 10,000 pounds from the British bank. However, upon arriving at the Swiss bank, the bankers refused to give her any money. First, they denied that any account had ever existed under her father's name, but upon seeing the ledger book, they then demanded that Estelle show a formal death certificate of her father, or she would not receive anything. While tragic, this story is not uncommon. By the end of 1939, Germany began stealing gold and other valuables from their victims and from governments in Europe. Allied nations immediately stopped trading with Germany, but it took until late 1940 for neutral nations across Europe, like Turkey and Sweden, to halt their trade with Germany as well. By this time, allies had warned neutral nations to not accept gold from Germany because of where it was coming from, but Switzerland ignored them. The president of the Swiss National Bank, Alfred Herz, was very biased to the Nazi cause. He refused to meet with American and British ambassadors during the war, but welcomed Nazis as men of honor. Heinrich Himmler himself had a personal relationship with Herz. Needless to say, despite the information about the stolen gold that the Allies informed Switzerland about, Switzerland refused to stop trade with Germany, and instead, the National Bank continued accepting gold. Despite Switzerland continuing to accept gold from Germany, most other nations in Europe did not. This gave way to a new problem. Germany still needed money to continue funding the Holocaust in their war effort. Given that Alfred Herz was quite sympathetic to the Nazi cause, he and other Swiss National Bank members devised a strategy to launder money to the German National Bank, the Reichsbank. In 1939 and 1940, Nazi occupation over Europe was underway. However, by 1940, Britain and France had placed currency controls over many countries in Europe in an effort to stop those countries from paying for German gold. Very early on, Switzerland became a clear target for Germany because currency controls did not affect the Swiss franc. In July 1941, the Swiss franc had become so strong that the gold price dropped below the minimum legal level. This allowed for Germany to be able to use Swiss francs to make payments to other countries in Europe after receiving the Swiss francs for the gold that they brought to the Swiss National Bank. This lending of Swiss francs to Germany during this period is a staunch reminder of how Switzerland was in fact not neutral, but rather very sympathetic to the Nazi cause. This trend continued until 1945. The currency constraints enforced at the start of the war did not allow for payment through German money, and by 1943, neutral nations in Europe refused to accept gold from Germany as well. In exchange for gold that was brought to the Swiss National Bank, the Reichsbank would receive Swiss francs, which they would in turn use to pay for imports from other neutral nations in Europe, because neutral nations accepted Swiss currency, but not German currency. This is how the triangular trade worked at this time, and it is extremely important because Switzerland could not provide everything that the Nazi war machine needed. While the Swiss National Bank continued to trade with Germany during the war, the leaders of the bank sympathized with the Nazi cause. However, they were not completely ignorant of the fact that the Nazis were expanding across Europe. Throughout the war, especially in 1939 and 1940, the Swiss National Bank was exporting large numbers of its gold reserves to foreign banks, particularly in the United States and Britain. Some of these assets had formerly belonged to Jews before the outbreak of the war. The Swiss National Bank was doing these things to protect its assets and its international banks from Germany in the event that they too were invaded. However, many complications occurred because of this, such as what happened with Joseph and Estelle Sapir. The money that the international banks in the US and in Britain became frozen in 1941 after the Allies had enforced currency controls over European countries. The acceptance of gold from Germany, money laundering schemes, investments into foreign banks, and ignorance of Allied warnings about trade with Germany had extreme consequences for the victims of the Holocaust after the war. Many Jews and other people who were destined to be victimized under Nazi rule had invested their money into the Swiss National Bank before its outbreak because Switzerland had a legacy of being neutral. They thought that their money would be safe there. And while the idea of being completely neutral and humanitarian is a wonderful concept, it is evident by examining Switzerland's actions throughout the war that it's extremely difficult. When the war ended, many Jews had returned to the Swiss National Bank in order to obtain the assets which their families had left for them before the war. The story of Joseph and Estelle Sapir is just one of hundreds in which the Swiss National Bank refused to give the money or any information about former accounts to victims of the Holocaust and their family members. In an effort to retain its neutral legacy, the Swiss National Bank covered up the fact that they were not neutral during the war, and a lot of that money was gone. This clearly was a major problem, and with the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Jews in Europe, it was an urgent problem. The Jews needed that money in order to either leave Europe or move away from the ghettos and the death camps which haunted them. The Jews also needed that money to assist in reestablishing themselves in society. This news was devastating to that community. Despite attempts at establishing a neutral and humanitarian image on the global stage, the actions that Switzerland partook in during the Second World War and in the second half of the 20th century show that they were not neutral and not as humanitarian as their legacy says they were. Despite Switzerland and other nations during World War II saying that they were neutral, the actions that took place would show otherwise. Switzerland during the Second World War was sympathetic to the Nazi cause, had very anti-Semitic leadership, and practiced ignorance of Allied orders. By doing so, the Swiss National Bank actively partook in the robbing of millions of Jews from their assets and helped other nations do so by laundering money to the German Reichsbank. After the conclusion of the war, the Swiss National Bank had a lengthy history of denying Holocaust survivors money that was rightfully theirs and suppressing the victims themselves. From this research and the stories of the victims, one thing is for certain. Switzerland was in fact not neutral during World War II and actively partook in the stealing from millions of Jews across Europe, and that's something that should never be forgotten or mistaken. Thank you.
We have an opportunity for questions, and Professor Bauer is going to walk around. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and Professor Bauer will catch you.
On this topic, how does it make you feel that people still to this day try to discredit the atrocities of the Holocaust and try to deny that it even occurred?
I think everybody can have a shot at this.
Well, for me personally, it's, and I hope for a lot of people, it's very concerning that they're trying to discredit this event. We see a lot of times in history that they try to erase history, much like, with Switzerland trying to cover up their past, so that more people don't know about it, don't learn about it, don't uncover those secrets. And so, even before all of this research and all of this, this class in general, it's very discrediting to see that there are people that don't believe that this actually existed. And I think it's just another tool of them trying to erase a narrative of history.
Yeah, and I think that I have no personal connection to the Holocaust. I don't have family that lived through it, but denying the Holocaust is actually quite offensive when there's an overwhelming amount of evidence and factual support that it actually happened. I think what it boils down to is to listen to the victims and to listen to the stakeholders of the event. And from all of our research, it's clear that it's very evident that this event did happen, and it's very disheartening to know that some people are actively trying to work to suppress it, because it's a very important part in everybody's history.
I'd like to quickly add, as much as I rationalized the doctor's actions, I stated at the beginning that this is like a very radical event. To discredit the Holocaust or downplay it in any way is just simply ignorant, and you should be blessed to know that you have the knowledge that what you have about the Holocaust. And as I've said throughout my paper, the environment and the world that you live in and the perspective that you have, you're almost helpless to it. So you should almost feel empathy for people that feel that way.
So my question is for Brody. So you mentioned how throughout, recently and throughout the 20th century, Switzerland was viewed as a neutral nation despite the actions that they took during World War II. Do you know how they kind of created that narrative for themselves after the war? And is there any instances of people from Switzerland fighting back and trying to get the real narrative out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of this conference is taking a 20-page paper and narrowing it down to a 10-minute speech. So there was more than half of my research that I had to cut out. So I'm very glad and happy that you asked me that. There were two investigations that were looked into the Swiss National Bank in the later half of the 20th century. That's why I still included that part. One was in the 60s and one was in the 90s, and how Switzerland was able to continue that legacy and kind of that narrative that they were neutral happened because of the 60s investigation, where researchers looked initially into the actual Swiss National Bank in Switzerland, and because top officials hid the assets so well, there wasn't a lot of findings in that actual bank that they could specifically determine belong to Holocaust survivors and people who perished before the Holocaust. And a lot of it was because it had been transferred out of the bank itself, right? So after that investigation, it was kind of like a golden ticket where Swiss National Bank workers were like, see, we didn't participate like you said we were, you can't find anything. So that's why they were able to continue that legacy. However, there was an investigation in New York City in the 1990s and early 2000s, led by a former U.S. senator. His name was Alfonso D'Amato. And he was Jewish, and he led the charge to say, I believe that there are assets being held in New York banks that were transferred during the war, which would prove that Switzerland did these things. And it was in that investigation where they were able to find the frozen assets from the Swiss National Bank, and that really broke open a whole new case that showed exactly what I presented.
My question is, again, to Brody about that. With that new case and those evidence, did any of the survivors or inheritance of these funds ever see any of the money eventually, or is it still going on today and people are still trying to get their money and assets?
So the issue that I ran into is by the time that this investigation concluded, which I believe was 2004, even people like Estelle, who were daughters of people who died in the Holocaust, by the time 2004 rolled around, they were very, very elderly. And a lot of these victims still lived in Europe or Switzerland, so it was really hard to get money from New York banks. So I didn't really look that far into that specific asset, but I did write down a fact that after the end of the 2004 investigation, they found that 118 million US dollars or 500 million Swiss francs belonged to Holocaust victims and were transferred to New York banks during the war. But I didn't really look into if they were ever transferred back because that part got a little foggy.
I want to make sure just so that we can balance. You guys have questions for the other two?
My question's for Garrett. In a class that I'm taking, we've recently been reading a book called Ordinary Men, which is about conscripts in World War II that were conscripted to the death squads. You know, they weren't military people, they were just average, everyday people. This book was a lot about how, one, they coped, and two, kind of the difference of people that felt what they were doing was right and what they were doing was wrong, and how those two sides coped as well. You said that they had a thirst for knowledge, these doctors. Do you feel that played a part in helping them push through and feeling like what they were doing is right, or was there also a common theme of them having to cope with knowing that they're doing messed up things, although they think it's for the greater good?
Yeah, it's a good question. We actually read that book in this class, and it's a fascinating tale. It partly did influence my research and my perspective on this subject. What you asked is how the experimenters felt, and did they have the same dynamic as what we see in those ordinary policemen. Yes, many of the doctors and experimenters took their lives after the war concluded, partly because they knew that they were about to be taken their lives from, and partly because they felt the guilt and the shame. But as I explained in the paper, the ideology that prevailed above them and the science that led up to it, it kind of took the ethics and pushed it down in their mental space. So they were able to operate past through that. They didn't see the subjects as ethical humans, only biological humans. So that allowed them to do that. I hope that answered.
Mine is kind of for Madison and Garrett. So I really appreciated the idea of like meaningfulness, helping the people stay alive. That was, sorry. I'm crying, that's not good. Okay, but Garrett, your presentation was hard to watch. Sorry. Just the senselessness of it, and the idea that like, you say they had a rationale, but I don't know why I'm crying. You help me. Basically you're saying that the rationale was like because they could, is that?
Yeah, those pictures were incredibly grotesque, and those were only on the surface of a lot of them. There were many passages I read while doing research where I would cry, and I don't cry. It was an incredible, treacherous event, but I took a stance on it. That's probably, it's emotional, but I believe it's my theory on it. I don't know, you want to?
The Holocaust is a very difficult subject, and I spent a lot of my time crying as well. But a lot of their rationale for making them do these performances was just because they could, and they didn't have to pay them to do it. And it's extremely terrible, and it's very difficult to deal with. But essentially, that was their answer, was because they could.
My question is for Madison. I'm kind of curious, what kind of impact did the arts that were taking place in the ghetto have on the arts that we know and love today?
That is a really good question. Because we lost a lot of the material, we don't see a lot of it performed today, but it definitely has influenced what we do see in especially the theater today. There is a lot of theater today based on the Holocaust and based on what happened. A lot of artists, following this event, because so much of it was destroyed, felt the need to kind of maybe replicate those or, make up for the fact that so many were lost. And so we see a lot afterwards where, especially survivors, were like, I lost so much, I need to redo this or I need to remake this. Now that I've lived through this event and I have a whole new perspective, the world needs to see this again. And, we see a lot that came out of it. We just recently here at PFW did, Ghetto, which is about ghetto life and Jewish maltreatment. So we don't necessarily see a lot of recreations of what exactly happened, but we see a lot that came out of it that is like, we have to make up for the fact that we lost so much. People need to hear this story. Maybe one last question? Okay. Mr. Bauer?
Thank you very much for your presentation. And something that I was thinking of throughout all three of your papers was the meaning of power. And I see things in reverse order. So I would start with how, when you're waging war against people, there's the power of these banking institutions, or there's the power of medical authority. But then there's also power in one's own art and satire and comedy. So I'm wondering, after your research, how might your research have you reflect upon the meaning and use of power in a different way?
I'll start really quickly. I mentioned motivations such as sadism, and that's kind of like enjoying seeing other people's pain, but I kind of more referenced it as enjoying having the power over other people's pain. I thought maybe they would get dopamine pulses from doing these ridiculous things, and redundant experiments towards their subjects. Like, for example, one experimenter randomly, arbitrarily picked out a subject and had his skull placed on his desk the next morning, and I think that was completely just a dopamine pulse because of the power of being able to do so.
Well, for me, I definitely got a totally different perspective on power, more so self-power. Yes, while the Nazi regime did force them to do these things, the people in the Terezin ghetto, they found so much, and it's difficult to say, so much joy in what they did despite everything else going on, and they really reclaimed that power. So for me, it shed a light on what power means individually to everybody, and it's not always, exerting power over another person. For them, it was exerting power over themselves, what they could do and what they were capable of despite everything else. They were like, well, I may not live to see tomorrow, but I can put on an awesome show tonight and live that to my best ability.
Which would help them cope.
Yeah.
From my research, reflecting on how the term power has kind of changed after my research, I would say that it has shown me how much power can turn something or someone very evil and bad and malicious. Even something as objective as a banking institution, because I'll admit when I first thought of this topic, I thought it was going to be the most dry, boring topic ever. But it's really taught me to acknowledge power and how important it is to listen to the people that don't have power or that your power has affected. I mentioned in my research how important that money was for Jewish and Holocaust victim families to escape from the things that were haunting them. And they couldn't have it because someone with power refused to give it up because of their own selfishness. And so I think that that's really affected my outtake on power.
Well, thank you so much for the amazing questions and, of course, for the 3 awesome presentations. Can we do a round of applause? As we go on break, the one thing I wanted to say, kind of personally, obviously, all of these papers were written last semester before the war, before the war started, and having listening to the presentations now. So much of this research, right, acquires an additional additional significance, right, both in terms of the power of the arts, in terms of power and abuse of power, and of course use of financial institutions for good or for not good. And so it's remarkable, right, that even these projects already mean so much more just a few months after the research was concluded. So thank you guys.